Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the LGS Pod, the Soccer Shorts companion podcast, where we try to shine a spotlight on stories about local grassroots soccer culture here in our hometown of San Diego, as well as across the U.S. and around the world. I'm John Cross, the founder of Soccer Shorts, and with me tonight, as always, is our co-host Dylan Wilson. Dylan, how are you doing tonight?
I am doing all right. It's been a busy couple of days, but it's nice to get to sit down and talk about some soccer or football, I guess, today.
Yeah. And anything interesting that you did since our last soccer-wise, I guess, since our last podcast?
I went to Fair Play, our local watering hole here in North Park, to enjoy the Spurs match Saturday morning with the group. So I got to see a lot of people I haven't seen since the end of last season. So that was fun. It was a good game, first Premier League game of the Thomas Frank era. So that was nice. Very excited about Mohamed Kudus. He's a player I've enjoyed for a long time. Probably the most successful Right to Dream product, really, as far as I'm aware of. I actually, funnily enough, I was at the last game he played at the Tottenham Hotspur Stadium last season when he was playing for West Ham, and he got sent off for slapping two people. So it was kind of a funny story to get to tell my partner Gabby when I was like, you remember that guy who got a red card for slapping people? Yeah, we signed him, and I'm very excited about it. So it was a fun game, and he's shown he had two great assists for two great goals for Richarlison, another favorite of mine. So great start to the season, but I got to stop myself or else I'll keep rambling.
All right. Well, congratulations to a good start to the season and to the league season. I know it wasn't maybe quite as happy the Wednesday before.
That's all right. It was a good game.
Glorified
friendly, isn't it?
Sure. For me, I don't know, not too much soccer, but I've been doing some reading, and especially with all the history things that we have been doing on the podcast and digging deep into some football history. There's a website and they have a podcast and stuff called Football Heritage, and they had a couple articles out that I found pretty interesting this last week. We can link to them in the show notes, but one of them is called Before the Franchise, and it's about Milton Keynes and their soccer history pre-MK Dons, which I found pretty fascinating because I think Milton Keynes as an area kind of gets slighted because of what happened with the arrival of the MK Dons, and kind of gets left off some of the conversation. So it was interesting to look into some of the deep history that had existed in the area prior to the old Wimbledon FC being moved on up. Well, not really up the road, but, moved away and then restarted as the MK Dons. So that was interesting. And then they had another article that was about Stoke. We always have the great sayings about Stoke here in soccer, but just kind of looking at the history and the importance of that club to the overall history in the football league and so forth of the beginnings of soccer. And, we talked a lot about that in the last episode, not Stoke in particular, but when we were looking at the organization of the football league and the beginnings of promotion relegation. So I just happened to stumble across both of those, and I thought they were short reads, very short, but I thought they were interesting articles, just kind of highlighting some of the things that we've been talking about. And then, of course, been following Bradford City still, my I guess longtime interest, but recent more interest. But they're off to a pretty good start, tied at top of the table, second I think on goal differential right now. But got a good start. I don't expect them to stay up there all season as a newly promoted team, but anything they can do to start getting some distance between the relegation zone and have a good strong season, I'll be happy with. Just to compete. But they had a good showing against Stockport today.
Nice. Well, a strong start can go a long way. So,
yeah, especially for a team that's kind of bounced around between League One and League Two. It'd be nice to see them get a foothold and stay in League One for a while and see if maybe they can make their way back up, to the top of the table in the future here. But
It's a
I'm sure, following them a little bit more as this season goes on.
it's a strong League One this year as well. Some big clubs have dropped down that far. Cardiff, some recent Premier League clubs, Cardiff, Huddersfield, Luton. Um,
Yeah,
you know, it it would they would do well, I think, to maintain that top half finish. Unless shit, maybe they're in for something special. Who knows?
yeah, that would be nice. But I think that, I mean, that's going to get into some of the conversations we've already had, and some conversations I'm sure we'll have over many episodes here as we look at the evolution of football pyramids and promotion, relegation, and how things change over time, and especially the overall strengthening. Even though I think we talk a lot about right now Premier League distancing itself from everyone else, and it certainly is in some respects, but there absolutely is a bit of a trickle down effect that gets to the other leagues as well, as some of these teams that were up there are moving down, and they were stronger. I mean, enough to be up in the Premier League at some point recently. Even though they might have had a brief run to get up and then we're right back out again. But you have those teams, and you have newer teams, not necessarily newer in terms of existence, but teams back into League One, like Bradford City. And yeah, I think it makes it overall pretty competitive. Both League One and League Two were quite wild towards the end of the season, and looking, getting towards both the playoff and the relegation picture.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I've even said that I think the gap between the Premier League and the Championship is starting to worry me. But I also can't deny that some of that is starting to, Ronald Reagan's given us the thumbs up from the grave, starting to trickle down towards some of these smaller clubs. Because you're right, the League One and League Two landscapes have gotten ridiculously more competitive in the last few years. And I'll tell you what, I've been paying attention to the English lower leagues probably about 10 years now. And I don't mean that to because I recognize that's not that long of a time relative to some folks, but the level of play has come a long way. I used to think of League One as pretty comparable to like USL Championship. And I think that it would give most League One clubs would give pretty much any USL Championship club a run for their money these days. So yeah, it's the level of play has come up, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, level of play, and as I will say until I die, that community aspect. It's fun to watch a stadium that's full of passionate fans that are involved in the game. It makes it a lot more fun than an empty stadium. No matter how good the quality of play is on the field, that fan participation, I was going to say experience, but that fan participation really elevates everything up a notch. It makes it a lot more enjoyable to watch as a spectator.
Yeah, and I don't know. My perception is that at least in England, the viewers fan attention has increased over the last 10 years or so in lower leagues in England, which I think is good for the game, obviously. I know non-league day has been a thing for the last 10, 15-ish years, where it's like a day set aside for people to go to non-league games. I think they try and schedule it on one of the, international break, something usually. So I think that's a cool movement, and it seems to have helped. So I think the stronger those clubs are, the stronger. I mean, having clubs in the National League drawing thousands is only a good thing for the game at those lower levels, I would say.
Yeah, and speaking of non-league games, it's a good transition for us, because our main focus tonight is going to be part 2 of our Pro-Rel series, where we are going to look at the bottom half of the English football pyramid. We last time on part 1, we looked at the top half, league football, which we call it, so the EPL and the EFL, and those first 4 levels. So now we'll take a look at the next 6 steps, as they're called in the system, and kind of how that evolved. So that'll be the main story we get to. But before we get there, we'll do some USL updates, because there's some interesting, especially stadium update news that came out in the last few days, and we'll do some cup news. But first, a couple of current event things let's get to. I want to get your thoughts about CBS Sports just announced, you probably saw this, that they are going to be, I think, airing 40-ish English language broadcasts of Liga MX games on their CBS properties.
I did not see that, actually. I managed to miss that in a lot of the news coming out this week.
Yeah, just announced just in the last few days. And then I think the day after it was announced, they had their first match. So I don't know if the timing was intentional just to build momentum, or what was happening, or if it had to do with the whole Skydance, right, sale. Don't know what it was, but yeah, they're doing some matches in English language for Liga MX. And again, I think this both makes me happy and frustrates me in the same kind of way, because on the one, I think it just highlights the amount of demand there is for the game of football in the United States, but frustrates me, and I hope the USL can capture this with promotion rel or with Pro-Rel, but frustrates me that we can't direct a lot of this or get people excited about the American version. And I've shared my thoughts many times on how I think MLS really helps stifle a lot of that. But you can't tell me, when we see these Premier League deals and all these other leagues that you can find all over this country, that there isn't a passionate fan base and demand in this country. And I think a lot of them would like to support a local team if it was better connected, I guess. Not just connected to the community, but better connected to the world's game. I think that's one of the reasons people have an interest in following a team outside of the United States. Like, you're a Tottenham Hotspur fan, and Tottenham Hotspur is connected with the rest of club football around the world, especially in Europe, because they participate in promotion, relegation, and then depending how you finish in a league, you can play in a European competition, and you play against other clubs from across the continent. And Spurs fans and Real Madrid fans and Juventus fans and PSG fans, they all share a connection because they can all face each other at some point in tournaments besides their league.
One of the, and we kind of talked on this when we talked about the Club World Cup, but one neat thing, despite a lot of the detractions you and I both have about it, is that in theory, with that set up now, any club from anywhere on earth could play any club from anywhere on earth. In theory, if both of those clubs went on a crazy tear one year and won their, I'm not saying like Spurs are going to win the Champions League and play some Tahitian team that somehow wins the Oceania Champions League in the Club World Cup. That's obviously not going to happen, but it could happen. Theoretically, it's not impossible. Right. And that's what makes the global game so interesting, or at least it's one of the things. And that applies for American clubs internationally, but not internally, right? And so it's certain
American clubs.
Well, right.
I mean, I guess technically everybody could be if you win the Open Cup.
Well, right. And
that's the one opportunity.
Right. And that's what I'm saying, is any club in America, theoretically, even as unlikely as it is, as impossible as it may be. However, a club that, I guess they could play in the Open Cup, but like a club will never, a USL2 club is never going to play an MLS club unless, again, somehow they drew in the Open Cup, I guess. But right. I guess that kind of undermines my point a little bit. But you see what I'm trying to say is like the global meritocracy, quote unquote, heavy air quotes.
Right.
Sort of excludes the United States clubs, which is frustrating.
Yeah, definitely. So let's move to international soccer here. Marshall Islands, I don't know if you heard, one of the last countries to finally be admitted into FIFA and have its own national team. Had their first matches ever over the weekend. Did you hear about this or follow it at all?
Did not, no. So the Marshall Islands is technically a U.S. overseas territory, right? But they Because I know some of them have their own, or is that not true? Am I thinking
I
something?
don't know. I think they are the Republic of the Marshall Islands or something. I'm not sure if they're
Yes, you're right.
just.
Sovereign nation in Micronesia. Yeah, I must be thinking of something else. I don't know.
Well, no, I think that I don't know when that happened, but I think that happened over time. These are the same Marshall Islands that we all have heard about in our history books of all the nuclear arms testing that we did out in the Pacific in and around the Marshall Islands, like at the Bikini Atoll.
That is what I'm thinking of. Yes.
Yeah. So these are the same Marshall Islands, and like a lot of these island nations in the Pacific that are on these atolls. So they're if you look at them geographically, they're thin strips of lands that sometimes are barely wider than a few hundred yards in some places. But you might have a main road that goes down and buildings on each side, and on the other side of the buildings is beach and ocean. So they finally got an international team together. They played in a tournament this weekend. The Virgin Islands and some other groups were there. I only know the Virgin Islands because that was their first match they played. They got well, I mean, I don't think it's terrible. They lost 4-0 to the Virgin Islands for their very first international match. But then later in the tournament, I think it was the second game, they actually scored a goal. So the first goal in history for the Marshall Islands. But again, what I love about soccer and the history part of it that always fascinates me, Dylan, do you have any idea where this tournament was played? Unless
Sorry,
you're finding it online.
No, I'm not. I'm actually just pulling up the Marshall Islands with the Google Maps. I wanted to pull up the capital city to see how thin the land was, and you're right.
Yeah,
It's very thin. Sorry, can you say the name of the tournament again? Or is that going to give it away?
I don't remember the name of the tournament.
Well, you're asking where it was played. I'm going to guess like Papua New Guinea or something like that. Maybe New Caledonia, Solomon Islands,
or Arkansas.
What? What the fuck? Oh my god. Okay.
So,
excuse my language. That's wild.
One of the things I learned, with the Marshall Islands, the Marshallese diaspora is like a lot of these island nations that are starting to get their land encroached by sea level rise. So some people are having to flee. I know the Marshall Islands, this whole other story, but put my science teacher hat on. I mean, they have a whole plan to try to battle climate change, but a lot of people have left over the years for a variety of reasons. And we have an agreement, the US does, with the Marshall Islands that allow them to come and work stuff. And they don't need a visa. It's an arrangement because of, setting off a bunch of nuclear bombs in their area.
That's what I'm thinking of. They're an independent nation. They're one of like 3 independent nations that are like the free association agreement with the United States because of the shit we did in the Pacific. Yes, that's what I was thinking of. Okay.
So, not to get into the entire history, but it has to do with some people coming over to get an education at some point. It has to do with some people working at Tyson Foods. So, basically, I think the town is named Springfield in the northwest corner of Arkansas. It's where the Tyson plant is. I don't know if it's their headquarters. But there's about 15,000 Marshallese that live in this community. They think they call it the Springfield Atoll as a nickname there. So this is one of the reasons it was held in Arkansas, because you have so many people. There's a couple other cities, but in the U.S. where people have, you kind of have a cluster of Marshallese. But I think this particular place in Northwest Arkansas is the largest at around 15,000. So that's why it was in Arkansas. I had no idea. I just stumbled across this, and then I was digging. I learned a little bit about history of the Marshall Islands and how many people are in the U.S. and have moved to the U.S. and especially in the last couple of decades have fled to the U.S. As sea level starts rising. And I also looked up because I knew the Marshall Islands had done some prep work as opposed to some other islands like Tuvalu, which, may be completely underwater by 2050. in terms of no usable land that they can live on. But the Marshall Islands, I know, have a plan, but I think they're going to try to relocate to the 4 biggest islands. And I don't know how many are part of their nation. I want to say it's probably potentially in the scores of islands that people could live on, but probably not over the next
They're mostly atolls,
rest of
though.
the century.
Even the capital city is just an atoll. Like, it's,
Yeah.
So
By the way, learned a bit of history there. It was kind of
yeah,
cool. Good to see another country get get a team. So you have another international team, and I love these stories of people working hard to make this happen. Unfortunately, it brings in some of the worldwide politics with climate change and everything else, and having a diaspora, which I'll share with you because I know we have talked about this, and maybe this is a good time, maybe for our next episode, to do the look at some of the FIFA, or not FIFA confederations, the other football confederations that are out there besides FIFA that cater to some of these groups that aren't officially recognized by
right.
FIFA and some of these other tournaments. So that might be a good segue for us to jump into that maybe in our next episode.
Definitely. Do you know? I'm assuming it's Oceania. Did they incorporate in Oceania or in CONCACAF?
I believe it's Oceania. I don't think it was CONCACAF.
That would make more sense, but
I think just location wise and the other islands they're near to have the matches. Yeah, I don't think it was. I don't think it was CONCACAF.
Okay, I mean, that makes sense, but Guam is in CONCACAF and Kazakhstan is in UEFA, so you never.
Yeah,
you never know.
It's weird.
You never know.
All right, let's switch over to some Open Cup news quickly. We finally, it looked like it may never happen due to weather, but we finally had the Philadelphia Red Bulls match played. Philadelphia won 3-2 in that Open Cup quarterfinal. Milanowski had a part in the second goal, I believe. So local San Diegan there involved. So we're now down to 4 teams, and semifinals, I think, semifinals coming up mid-September. And any thoughts on the 4? I have to look at which of the 4 teams are left altogether.
Yeah, let me pull that up.
I can't even remember. Let's see if I have it up here.
It is Nashville versus Philly and Minnesota versus Austin. I'll be honest with you. I would struggle to think of a 4-team combination for semifinals that I would care less about. Like, I just don't.
I am not certain because I can't remember about Philadelphia. But I'm not sure any of them have won a U.S. Open Cup in this form. Not a team, like there have been teams from Philadelphia that have won it, but I don't think any
Austin
of the 4 teams
and
that
Nashville
have
have definitely not, because they're very new clubs, or relatively new clubs. Minnesota, I don't know. Maybe because they existed.
I don't think so
prior, but I also don't think so.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that might be an interesting storyline for that portion. So let's look to the 2026 World Cup. I believe by the end of this week. So
Minnesota was the runner-up in 19. Sorry, did want to put that out there for the Open Cup.
Okay. Got it. For the 2026 Open Cup, I think we should know by the end of this week at least half the teams for the first round. And I think we're also supposed to know the teams that are participating in the Open Cup qualifying tournament. I think we should have that news by next week. I thought the 21st was supposed to be the date for that. So we'll keep an eye out for that, and kind of I've already kind of turned towards 2026 and getting excited about some of these amateur teams that are going to be in there, and getting ready for some of these qualifying tournaments that are going to be coming up in the fall. And I would imagine, because we've had some in the past, we'll see if we can get some teams from locally here in San Diego, see if some of our UPSL teams or any of our other teams might join that qualifying tournament. Maybe we can get out and check out a match for one of those qualifying tournaments.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. Also, Jägermeister Cup quarterfinals are tomorrow, I believe, Wednesday for us.
That's
And
right.
we've got a few teams. I got to see if also I can find that. Yeah, we got Indy 11 versus the Greenville Triumph. I guess one of the things about the 8 teams that are left, there's not any super strong teams. It's not dominated, I guess, by your strongest teams. There's a lot of mid-table teams
Yeah.
here. Even the League One team that made it through Greenville is about mid-table, but Indy 11 is mid-table. I guess you got the Loudoun and Sacramento Republic, and Sacramento's been on a bit of a run, so those are probably the two strongest teams. But I'll check those out. Rhode Island, I'll watch Koke play and Stoneman and some of the loyal, players that we used to have. But I guess the San Antonio Hartford match also. Hartford's had a bit of a tournament run here. They kind of been the upset kings in the tournament. So we'll see if they can keep that going. Siaha is in goal over there at Hartford. So a lot of
No, that's
old
right.
loyal connections in some of the teams that are left here in the last 8 teams, the quarterfinals here of the USL Cup.
Yeah, I will definitely be trying to tune into these. I'm looking at the tables, and I think so. Loudon go through. They must have gone through on one of, because they had some strange tiebreakers, right? It was like goals scored was ahead of goal difference for tiebreakers, because Loudon have equal points with Louisville and Charlotte, but a worse goal difference, but have gone through. So they
Yeah, I think it
must
was goals scored.
goals scored. Okay. So, but see, that was both of those other teams had more goals. Loudon had 5 and 3 conceded versus 8 and 4.
Yeah, it might have been head to head first. I don't
Maybe head to
remember.
head. Yeah, interesting. Okay, I'll have to look into that off air. But yeah, that's kind of curious.
All right, let's keep it in the USL here, because there's some stadium news, quite a bit of stadium news. I think last week we talked about the new Detroit City Stadium, and they had some renderings come out. Sacramento broke ground on their new stadium earlier this week, I think maybe on Monday, and Pittsburgh Riverhounds today shared plans for their new stadium. Have you seen this stadium yet?
I have. I actually pulled up the article because I wasn't sure if you were going to have seen that just yet. Yeah,
Yeah, I'm gonna pull it up, and I have.
I really like that. I like those renderings a lot. I think the Riverhounds no, it's not Keyworth. It's what do they call the stadium there? Whatever, it doesn't matter.
Highmark? Is that
Highmark,
Highmark?
that's it. Yeah. It's one of the most unique stadiums with the way that it's right on the river, and they kind of have it built so that you can enjoy that aspect of it. So I love that they've kept that. And I also love that this is clearly with an eye to them being in the USL D1 come
Yes.
2028 or whatever that is. So yeah, I big fan of that. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, our Pittsburgh fans might have to correct me if I'm wrong. I think those little corner things are a nod to Heinz Field, where the Steelers play. I think they have a similar architectural feature at that stadium. So I believe that's a Pittsburgh thing.
And I think those are going to be some of their luxury suites there in the corner. And again, I think we mentioned this with the Detroit City Stadium. I really like these kind of corner designs to take some
Yes.
of those type things in the corner and leave the center section, all along the touchline and behind the goals to be like for the fans, for the paying ticket fans out there. I think that's better, and especially better on television than looking at a bunch of skyboxes all the way across
Yeah,
the stadium. It
definitely.
just feels very corporate when you do that.
Yeah, it does. I don't know. Maybe it's just me, but I'm looking at a picture of Heinz Field right now. In that stadium, it's the spirals are used as like a staircase or a ramp, rather, like they are at a lot of stadiums. But it's
Right.
clearly designed with that kind of in mind. I think that's it's a clear nod. And I think the stadiums are just across the river from each other because they both overlook that yellow bridge. And I know PNC Park is right there too. So anyway, yeah, big fan of Pittsburgh stadiums in general. And I think this is going to be a nice addition.
I absolutely love that stadium. I saw the renderings for that, and that's I really USL is at least in the last couple hitting it out of the park. I saw the Sacramento one. It looks more like a traditional stadium. It doesn't have a roof on it. But this one, just like Detroit City's, feels like a football ground. I mean, it feels like a proper football ground. And I think that also helps when you're trying to sell and market the game, not just for people showing up, but when you show it on television for games. I think that has a huge difference than being just kind of a more traditional bowl kind of setting, which is not really what the Sacramento one is. It's more rectangular, but it doesn't have any kind of ceiling, no roof structure to it at all, which is a personal disappointment.
Yeah.
And especially for how hot it can be in Sacramento.
Well, that's true. I think part of the idea with the plainness of the Republic Stadium is that they're meant to be able to expand it. I believe.
Yes, I think that is part of what. I don't know if that's intentional for the roof piece not being there, at least at the moment. But I did hear something about expansion. I think in this initial stage, though, it was more like 12,000 with some. It could go to 15,000 with some temporary kind of seats.
Well, right. So, I think there's definitely going to have to be some sort of concession that U.S. Soccer gives to the USL for this D1, but it is encouraging to see these clubs pushing for stadiums that will be compliant either way.
Yes.
I wanted to say last thing, and I kind of touched on this already, but the thing I love about that Pittsburgh stadium is the way it's so unique to the setting it is in and the city of Pittsburgh. The city of Pittsburgh, it's right on the confluence of two rivers. So it's kind of like that, almost like three islands kind of set up. Not three islands, but like three banks sort of set up they've got going on. So it's a very unique city. And to have all these stadiums built around the water like that and to have those views, I think it in the same way that Petco utilized the Western Metal Building or, some of the European soccer stadiums like incorporated their surroundings into the stadium. It's those unique things that give these stadiums such charm. And, Highmark was already on my list, but it just shot up to easily one of the top ones I want to go see at some point. So,
well, it makes them unique. And I remember, I never actually went to Candlestick, but Candlestick and Qualcomm are like, they were identical stadium. They were built, I don't know, by the same person, but like you felt like you almost were in the exact same stadium. And that I really don't like. I like the stadium I'm in for that team to have some character and purpose for whatever team is going to be playing and whatever sport is going to be playing in that stadium. I know it's an expense. I know it's a land use thing, but if I just put on my sport glasses, I like each type of sport to have their own stadium and not be sharing, not necessarily teams not sharing, but not sharing like with a big running track around it. I'd rather our track athletes have their own stadium and their own track and get away from these multi-purpose ones. But that's, not putting my land use hat on either. So, but from a purely sporting perspective, that would be the ideal scenario for me.
Well, and not to offshoot on this tangent, I could go on too hard, but it's not even really a land use issue. It's a transportation choices issue. And can people make money off of it issue, really is. Yeah. Anyway, take public transit. Sorry.
To just kind of put a button on the stadium issue for USL, I stumbled across, I don't really listen to the One Soccer Nation podcast, but they had Jason Papadakis on their, I guess it was August 1st episode. And for those who don't know, he is one of the USL executives. I can't remember the exact position. I didn't go back and look it up, but he's involved in their, for I guess for the cynic people, in the real estate side of USL soccer, but in helping these clubs and teams get over the finish line for these stadium deals. And in that interview, which I scrubbed through pretty fast, there was a quote in there, and I added that the USL currently has 70, that's 70 active stadium developments going on. I just went through the numbers quickly just of their pro teams right now, and they sit at about 51 total pro teams between the women's side and the men's side. And then you think about, we've heard stories that there's 20 to 26 somewhere in there, things on the horizon that are coming into USL on the men's and women's side. So, maybe that's the roughly 70 active stadium developments that are going on, that they're looking to have a big sea change here over the next 5 to 10 years. We already know of several of them that are in the works. Fort Wayne, Indiana is in the middle of building their stadium. We've heard stories of a bunch of different, but I had no idea that and who knows what phase that's in. I mean, if that's just conceptualizing right now, but there are 70 active stadium developments going on within the USL right now. That was a huge encouragement to me that this moving forward of USL and this looking ahead toward promotion relegation, and they're already the focus of really trying to connect with their community, it gives me even more hope that this Pro-Rel USL pyramid experiment in the long run will work.
Yeah, and I think too, for all the complaining that I and others have done over all this time, saying we wish they had done Pro-Rel sooner, I think the firm base of clubs they've established in the last 5 to 10 years will go a long way to helping that pyramid be successful. And I think in the long run, we'll look back and be glad they took the time that they did, I think.
Yeah, and that's going to be part of an interesting conversation we're going to get into in a minute with the National League system there in England. And we talk about clubs versus leagues. We'll get into that when we do that conversation. But I want to hold off on my comments for that, just to, again, wrap up our whole USL stuff. We do have the Super League getting ready to start, I think, this weekend coming up. And just another San Diego connection. We had talked about before Carrie Taylor, who helped launch the San Diego Loyal and was involved in the Soccer City stuff pre-San Diego Loyal. She was working at USL headquarters, but is now the director of soccer operations for the Spokane club. So that's both the Zephyr on the women's side, and now I'm blanking out, Velocity, right? Spokane Velocity on the League One side for the men. So she's now the director of soccer operations up there at Spokane. So big shout out to Carrie.
Nice.
Okay, and then my last little question to you in terms of the Heat stuff that we've had, the NWSL game that was suspended by Heat. I know whenever we talk about going to a fall-spring calendar, there's always comments about the weather and being too cold. I really think, and I said this before, I don't think on this podcast, but with other people, I really think by 2030, I think every league will probably be going to a fall-spring schedule because it's getting harder and harder to play summer games safely.
Yeah, and
the Heat.
Right, and those colder places will be heating up. And I say this as somebody who's only spent a few years of my life living in somewhere it snows, and even then, Flagstaff, it was kind of a light snow. I would say it would usually melt relatively quickly. I don't know, man. Like, they do it in fucking Norway. Like, I think people in Indianapolis can figure it out. That's just kind of my take. So, although I guess Norway does do the summer season, so that's a bad example, but they still play European football in like February. So I don't I don't know. Fine, Denmark. There you go. It gets really cold in Denmark. I think it snows in a lot of places, and they still play a winter calendar, so it's not undoable. I don't know. I feel like people overblow the degree to which that renders it undoable.
Yeah, as we have said on this podcast, I think actually the bigger issue is the infrastructure needed to keep your grass alive,
Yeah,
like to have a good
right.
playing
That's
surface,
fair.
because it's going to need different kind of drainage, built-in heating, and grow lights. I mean, you're going to need that kind of stuff to be able to keep a good, playable field in the cold weather climate. I think that is a bigger issue, because if you have an important game, we see it in college football when it gets towards the end of the season in cold weather areas. I mean, unless it is, we see it in the NFL for playoff matches. It's people, Buffalo, places that still have outdoor stadium. It's, um, people will show up
Yeah.
like that, unless it's, like the World Cup qualifier that everybody likes to point to in Minnesota, that I think it was Minnesota where it's played, right? Where it was minus 10. I don't know. Whatever it should not have been played. And just like those matches shouldn't be played, players should not be playing when you've got these high temperature and high humidity situations. You're people in the stadium, people on the field, you're putting their health at safety, like, or health at risk. It's not safe to play in those conditions.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean extreme temperature on either side, right? Really, right? They should be canceling games. It doesn't matter.
Yeah. All right. Let's move to our big story that we're going to talk about for the rest of our podcast here, and that is getting into the second part of our Pro-Rel series. Last time in part one, we focused on the top 4 levels of the English pyramid. So that's the English Premier League, and then the 3 levels of the EFL, or English Football League. So the Championship, League One, and League Two. And we didn't really talk about what was happening underneath it. We did a little just briefly, but now we want to take a look at the National League system, which are those next 6 levels, or as they call it, steps 1 through 6 of the pyramid. So that's from, we're going below League Two and starting with the National League. And we're going to look at those. So just as we do a review from last time, those top 4 levels account for 92 teams between those first 4 levels. And then if we look at what's down below in 2025, as we're starting up a new football season in England, this is your National League system, these steps. Now, they go down these next 6 levels. They don't go all the way down to like your Sunday league kind of thing within your cities. In fact, if we want to be absolutely clear, we always joke like you could take your pub team all the way up through the system. And while yes, you kind of can, there still is a distinction between non-league soccer and then grassroots soccer, and there's not necessarily in all places a direct connection from that into the National League system. But really, the National League system is more for, I'll phrase it as proper grounds, or more proper grounds that are closed in for the most part. You're not just playing at a place with a whole bunch of fields out there and a match, which we can see in a lot of Sunday league, Saturday league type leagues for adults that are more at the true local grassroots level. So in this system, just like at the top, everything's bound by promotion relegation. At the very top in step 1 is the National League, which probably in the US, a lot of people became familiar with the National League through Wrexham and the Welcome to Wrexham documentary series. I'm sure there's a lot of people that knew about the National League before that, but that exposure of the Wrexham team and moving up through these levels that they've done the last few years certainly exposed a lot more people to the structure of both league football and the very, very top, at least, of non-league football. So you have the National League at step one. Below that, it splits into two. You've got the National League North and the National League South. That's all really considered the National League. It controls both those steps, kind of like the EFL controls 3 different levels between the Championship, League One, and League Two. And then below that, it keeps splitting up. So you've got 5 more levels. And then when you get to that third step, there are 4 divisions. When you get to that 5th step, there are 8 divisions. And then when you get to the sixth step, I've lost count, I lost track. But anyway, a 1, 2, 4, 8, 16 kind of format, more of a true kind of pyramid, a wider base funneling up to the top, as opposed to league football. The EPL and the EFL really is just a column. I mean, we call it a pyramid, the whole thing, but it's a column, right? You have one league sitting on top of another league, single national leagues across the entire country, right? The difference between national league or a regional league. So your last full national league is what's called the National League, and that's the top of your National League system for non-league football. And that non-league football is a term that has stuck around for a long time because even before the Premier League broke away and became the Premier League, there were 4 levels of the football league. So that's what it was referred to. You either played in the football league or league football, or you were outside of the football league. So you were non-league football. And that's really where the distinction came in between those, and people still use those distinctions between league football and non-league football. And then again, like I said before, probably even below that, grassroots football. So we're at the point now where all the divisions in the top 4 steps of the National League system have 20 to 24 clubs. Once you get below that, there's a little more of an imbalance. But because you divide up into a National League and then 2 regional leagues below that, and then 4 below that, and then 8 below that, as you can imagine with promotion relegation, you could get unbalanced. If you have 2 feeder leagues coming into the league above it, well, if the 2 leagues that get relegated from the top league fall in one region, but the other ones that get promoted come from the other region, you start to get imbalanced numbers. So the FA does have a committee, and that committee helps each year, if necessary, to balance some things out, maybe shift some teams laterally to try to maintain those numbers. But if you go all the way, this is just the next 6 levels or the next 6 steps. Once you get below step 6, leagues are run by the local county FAs, and then each county kind of structures it beneath that. So if you are in a highly densely populated area, like some areas of London, you can go down, if I remember correctly, it's like another 10 steps. So 20-ish levels all the way down to the bottom, but it's not 20 levels everywhere across the country, right? Just places that have higher density, they can funnel down it and still have steps through their county leagues that feed into this National League system. And then outside of that, you still have some of your other grassroots kind of football leagues where really people are just playing for fun. Not really looking to take a team up the pyramid. Now, it is important to note that this version that we just described of the National League system, I'll say maybe generously, is only about 20 years old. But really, I mean, there were some still significant changes that were being made in the last 5 years to this, especially over the pandemic. So this is still an evolving system, and most of this work to the system really has probably been done the last 2 to 3 decades. It really was a focus of the FA in the 90s, and we'll get to that in a second. And then one of the things I found interesting in doing a lot of this research was we have, I know, a couple of social media accounts and some other people who just keep a list of all the defunct soccer clubs in the US. Every team that has, and we just talk about the graveyard of soccer clubs in the US. And I think this is a fundamental difference of how the United States has approached sport as opposed to the way the English has approached sport, especially in terms of football, is that if you go there, I know there's a Wikipedia page and we can link to it in the notes that shows I think there's 92 different pages on Wikipedia dedicated to leagues that are defunct in English football. And that may sound horrible, but really the league is just kind of the structure for clubs. So as clubs maybe shift around or as new groupings of clubs happen, the clubs generally stay. Just a new league kind of forms around that, which we're going to talk a lot about that here in a few minutes. But I really think that highlights a big fundamental difference between how each of our countries have approached this idea of sport, and especially professional sports, where we try to protect the ownership groups and close off the system. And in England, there's more an independence of clubs and clubs looking out for themselves. And a lot of times the reason a league goes defunct or a new league is formed is because clubs want to band together and create maybe a league above another set of leagues. So they challenge each other, which again, we'll talk about in a second. So before we find out how we got here over the last 60 or so years, Dylan, do you have any questions or comments?
Yeah, just that it's one of the reasons what you kind of just described there, the independence of club versus league, I think is one of the reasons that Detroit City has been such an interesting story over the last decade. Is that, I mean, I recognize it's more complicated than this, but they are the closest thing that America has to a club that exists independently of whatever league it's in, and that could theoretically survive as a club were a league to fold. So that's
Chattanooga might be another one.
That's a good point. Yeah, thing. Chattanooga, and I'm sure there's others, but those are the only two really that have been stress tested. You know,
right? And I think what we, especially with Detroit City potentially in a few years here becoming a Division I team, I mean that really is more of the model you would see in England. The club stays together. It moves to whichever league best fits its interests. The fans stay involved. The team doesn't change its name or become something else. And I think, again, that's a fundamental difference where we have such control by the league. And when we do think of individual teams, say within the NFL, but I think we think of the NFL in this country more like as a property, the NFL, the NBA, same thing with MLS. We will talk all the time about our frustrations with MLS, and I really try to separate that MLS league structure from individual teams. But I think that's where we get in trouble with some arguments in this country, is because if you attack MLS as a league, you're attacking my team. I think that's how people see it. It's a like we're, and you know, I guess if we're going to the very cynical splitting hairs, right? All the teams are part of MLS because of its single entity structure. But even in other leagues, you know, if you attack the NBA, you're attacking my team. Whereas it's not seen that way in most other countries. It's my club, right? My club can play in any league, but it's my club that is here. It's not the league that I'm supporting or rooting for or anything else. It's the way we've tried to, I think, force manufacture that. Again, also, I think because we've always tried to jump at the top. We've tried to make a very top, high level league. And to do that, you need money. So to get the money, you put things in place to protect owners. And then we don't get a more natural development of the sport. We get this, like we complain about now in politics, we get our billionaire class way up here, and then everybody else kind of fighting for the crumbs instead of building a robust soccer environment for soccer, at least in our country here.
And not to wade too deeply into politics, but America historically does kind of as a society take more of that stance of reverence towards wealthy people and view
Yeah.
wealthy people spending their money as like goodwill rather than rich people doing what rich people do. And I do hope that this large kind of groundswell moment we're currently seeing of like populist anti-billionaire kind of sentiment in the country. Like, again, not trying to wade too deep into politics, but I think that soccer kind of is intrinsically tied to more progressive politics in the United States. And so I'm
Yeah, it
hoping
is.
that like those things can kind of rise together, and by those things I mean this populist anti-billionaire kind of sentiment and a more anti-billionaire pro-worker sentiment in our sports too, because people, even when the casual fan talks about sports, that there's this very, like, even if they don't use words like benevolent or gratitude or things like that, there's a very
Right.
like benevolent slant to the conversation when you're talking about owners and sports. Like they right and a good example of this, and I always have this conversation with people often say athletes get paid way too much money. No one ever says owners are making way too much money, even
Yeah.
though those complaints are actually really saying the same thing when you think about it. And so
Right.
there's really a big cultural difference. um, Whether that's actually going to shift, maybe I'm just a little bit in an echo chamber, but yeah, it's a really interesting societal comparison that has never been lost on me since I became more aware of the way they do soccer in the rest of the world, because it's the meritocracy we like to pretend our society is here, you know?
Right.
So anyway, again, not trying to dive in on politics, but I've always found that kind of comparison and connection pretty interesting.
All right. I agree completely on that. Let's go ahead into kind of our second part of this overall part two that we're doing. And we're going to jump into how we got here for this National League system. So we're going to start our story for today's podcast here in 1959. So 1959 was the year that the Football League changed their regional Division 3, because if you remember from our last podcast, you had Division 1, Division 2, but Division 3 was split into a North and a South. And then in 1959, they took the top teams from the North and South. They made that the Division 3. Everybody else was Division 4. So now you had 4 divisions in the Football League. And, I don't know the full story. This is something I'd like to dig a little deeper and find out. I mean, the Football League could have kept going, could have gone down to a 5th division and so forth. But I think, when you get to 92-ish teams, there's probably at some point, you just can't keep extending yourself to try to do what's best for all these different leagues at different levels. And that might even be, well, it is a little bit, I think, part of the story of the breakaway for the Premier League. So 59 is when that split happened. So that's your league football. Everything else is non-league. So if you look at pre-1959, before that happened, it's a hodgepodge of non-league football teams. They're arranged in their own regional leagues. They are still competing and they're trying to do well, and they're hoping to get into now what is Division 4 after 1959. And again, remember, like, you have Pro-Rel, but it's just through 1, 2, 3, and then the top part of 4. But you don't necessarily get relegated out of the bottom division. And this is what happened throughout the history of the Football League. The 4 teams, in this case, at the bottom of Division 4, were going to be up for a vote. So they still could be voted back in, or if there's another strong team, someone could decide to vote them in instead of one of the bottom 4 teams. So there's no guarantee you're going to be relegated. You could be. And there's no guarantee anybody was going to be promoted. So, from 59, once that happened through pretty much most of the 60s, there weren't really teams that got voted in to Division 4. It was hard for them, and it's it really, really doesn't start changing till we get into the 70s. Actually, sorry, misspoke on that. Let me back up just a second. I had a couple of my notes mixed up here. Also, during this time, it's important to know that there are semi-pro leagues in your non-league football, and there are amateur leagues, very strong amateur leagues. Your stronger ones are your semi-pro leagues because they're paying players, and your better players are probably going to go and get paid. But there still were a lot of leagues that were purely amateur still. And that didn't start changing till about the mid 70s, because it was 74 when the FA decided, okay, we're not going to make a distinction anymore between semi-pro and professional and amateur. You're just a club. And once that started changing, that really also started to change what was happening in non-league football and started to get a little more structure starting to form underneath. So four of the strongest leagues at this time were the Southern League, which was semi-professional, which was London and surrounding areas, and the Midland League. Those were both semi-professional, but then you had a Northern League, which was strictly amateur, and you had the Isthmian League, which was also around London, and then moving out to the south and east, also strictly amateur. So I want to make sure I said that right. Northern League was strictly amateur, and the Isthmian League was strictly amateur. And they really staunchly believed that they were to stay amateur. They didn't like the idea of paying players. And again, still some very good teams playing in these leagues. But especially after 1974, we see a lot more of a switch, and everybody just starts integrating, whether you're amateur or semi-professional. So what starts to happen is the Southern League starts to become the dominant league, and more of their teams are getting the better chance to try to crack into Division 4. The Northern clubs in 1968 decide to band together. So there's really 4 leagues kind of in this northern area. They're all decently strong, but the better clubs from each of those decide, you know what we need to do? We need to form our own league on top of these other 4 that we have in the area, for those of us who want to challenge ourselves and try to break into Division 4, because we're just not getting recognized in the same way. So that's what they do. They form what's called the Northern Premier League, and they do that to kind of have those leagues can band together and kind of become a rival to the Southern League, so that they could get into Division 4. Now, between 68 and 79, one of the things both the Southern League and the Northern League, or the Northern Premier League, realized is that when it would come up for these votes, that a lot of times the Southern League winner and the National Premier League winner were kind of splitting their votes a little bit. So they were cannibalizing each other, and it was hurting their chances to get in. So eventually, in 1979, they decide to form what is called the Alliance Premier League to sit above the National Premier League and the Southern League. So again, you take the strongest teams from the Southern League and the strongest teams from the National Premier League. You make this new Alliance Premier League to say, hey, we've got one winner here, or whatever winners, but the idea is like, we've got a winner here, and we want that winner. We're going to put them up as the representative to try to get in. And it was a great idea. But really what happened initially was, I think it took more than 6 years for a team to even get voted in, even though they organized that. But I find it very interesting that during this process from 59 to 79, so 20 years, instead of like the football league started, like there's the top league, and then we just kept adding below it and adding below it. In this case, with your amateur leagues, you had a gap. You were kind of missing a middle class, so to speak. So what they did is they worked from the bottom and kept kind of building leagues up above and building leagues up above to try to create that pyramid moving up towards the top and say, okay, here's our representative to go into Division 4. So we'll pause there again for any questions or comments, Dylan, before we kind of look at kind of this really big change that starts to happen between 79 and 87. We see the initial spots, and then once we get into the 90s, it really starts moving forward. But I'll let you jump in.
I mean, it's just kind of frustrating because it's everything people like you and I have said that the U.S. Soccer Federation should have been doing from the beginning. And if they had, we might have like the strongest football league in the world. And yet here we are.
Right. And I think, again, I think depending when people start following soccer or how deeply they want to look at the English football pyramid, and especially the history of it, it's interesting to see the different ways the football league took shape. You kind of had your halves at the top in league football, but the ones who were left out, they just kind of kept organizing and organizing and organizing until they were knocking on the door. And we're not going to get into all the politics and everything. I mean, there's, of course, a lot of politics that are happening here. We're really simplifying the history. But really, to organize from bottom up, to start knocking on the door of the football league and say, and talking to the FA, like, hey, we need a legitimate pathway, from the football league down to non-league, and not this voting piece. And I think there's so many parallels to things we've seen in this country where we've tried to organize. And I think probably, I would argue, especially in doing a lot of this research, I think one of the biggest faults of U.S. soccer, not only just two things. U.S. soccer, as you said, not helping guide this, but also because of the lack of guidance from U.S. soccer, we tend to get anything that starts to take hold. Let's say the UPSL, which started in Southern California, but as people started seeing something being successful, then it spreads all the way across the country. So we got the UPSL that spread across the country. We have the NPSL that spread across the country. We have USL 2 that spread across the country. But they're all fighting against each other. Whereas I really enjoy what I've seen in the Midwest Premier League and the APSL over the last, especially decade, where it's regional teams kind of staying away from those, just doing their own thing and kind of creating, again, a league up on top, kind of this English system of building from the grassroots. Because like England, where you had league football and non-league football, and there was that huge gap between Division 4, not necessarily in terms of play, but in structure. I think we've seen that here in the U.S. You got Major League Soccer, which is initially the top league, but that's it. You're only going to get in if you have an owner that has millions and now billions of dollars. And then we have a lot of people playing down at these lower amateur levels, but there's no middle class in our soccer pyramid. USL has tried to create that, might be successful in the long run here, but we have very few kind of attempts to bridge that gap between the very top and the very bottom of the pyramid in this country.
It's the classic missing middle that can apply to anthropology, the soccer pyramid, the housing shortage. It's a very versatile term.
Yeah. It is. All right, so let's jump in and see how this changed. From 79 to 87, now that we have this Alliance Premier League that's sitting above the Northern Premier League and the Southern League, we're starting to get some organizing underneath those two leagues as well as to how things feed in. Because even those teams, even if they may not make it into Division 4, they have some movement that they can do at the non-league level. So now that we have a single top league through our non-league kind of hodgepodge of, I'm using the word league a lot, but all these regional leagues and different things. But now we have one national single league. You're able to start building that pyramid below it. Now, as we said, once that league was formed in 79, no champion from the first 7 years was voted into the football league at Division 4. But eventually, all this pressure and the among some other things that are happening throughout soccer in England, because remember, this is prime hooliganism time. Like there's all these other backstories that have influence that we're kind of glossing over with the different reports. And as we said last time, Hillsborough, right? All these, the Hazel disaster, the Bradford City fire. There's all these big changes coming to football grounds across the country. And part of the changes that happen in 87 is what is now being in 87 becomes the football conference instead of the Alliance Premier League. So it changes its name to the football conference. And now it gains one automatic berth into Division 4. Well, now that you have that automatic berth, you already had some promotion relegation happening in the couple steps below the old Alliance Premier League. So now you've got like 7 levels of an English pyramid connected, but you kind of have that bottleneck at Division 4 between what is now called the football conference and Division 4. You only get one place, one relegated, one promoted to move up and down. So again, to put some of this also in perspective, 1987, that's just 5 years before the English Premier League was formed, right? This is when this happened. This is not, I mean, people think of the Premier League. There's some people who are old enough to live through the entire life of the English Premier League as they've been following soccer. This automatic promotion piece only happened 5 years before the Premier League, between non-league football and league football. So we get that. We get 2 clear steps below the football conference. And in those steps down below, one of them, the Isthmian League, which has dropped their amateur status by this point and has accepted, you could be amateur, professional, doesn't matter. But because they're London and down to the southeast of London, they also start organizing with a top league and kind of creating their own pyramid down below. So they go a little deeper down in steps than the umbrella for the Northern Premier League or the Southern League. So in 92, along with the EPL being formed, the top 4 divisions rebrand. So we now have the EPL, and then we have Division 1, 2, and 3, which is now the bottom of the league football pyramid. And then in the 90s, pretty much, I don't know, immediately after, this is not really a date that something happens, but over the course of the 90s, the FA really decides to get in and structure non-league football. We've already got kind of that structure that happened just through clubs making it happen, but really organize that non-league structure down there and create or give clubs a clear path for promotion and relegation from the bottom levels of non-league football, whatever that's decided to be, all the way up through the Premier League. So again, that's just in the 90s. Right? So we'll pause there for a second, and then we'll get our wrap up for this and kind of how things shaped up over the last couple of decades. Any comments or questions, Dylan?
Yeah. I mean, you've kind of alluded to it. I think myself included, I think a lot of people just don't realize how recent a lot of these things are,
I didn't. I mean, I knew some things because I'm a bit of a history nerd and like looking at this, but I did not realize how much of the structure and some of the things that, you go and you look up things, even in, like, I think in the pandemic, I spent a lot more time looking at things because we didn't have games and you're bored and you find things to research and do, at least I did. And I was surprised to, even when you first look and like, wow, robust pyramid structure. Could we ever have something like that in the US? But then when you start digging, like that robust pyramid structure is pretty darn new. It really is not, especially when we talk about all these levels down through step 6 and this, you know, at step 1, you have a national league, and then you have 2 below that and 4 below that and 8 below that. That's a relatively new thing with, as we said in the beginning, several significant changes happening even in the last 5 years to it. All right.
And
so let's go ahead and
that's
wrap
kind of,
this up. Yeah,
well,
go
I was
ahead.
just going to say that's kind of what gives me optimism about what the USL is trying to do. Is I know a lot of people, and especially detractors of this idea of promotion relegation in the United States, like to point at the idea that you can't just develop the finished product like that, like in one fell swoop. But that kind of ignores the history of promotion and relegation in a larger pyramid in pretty much the entire world. So I think what the USL is doing is more on the right track than anything we've seen in a long time. And it's learning the history of things like the English football pyramid that gives me more hope than a lot of other things.
Yes. I'm going to see if I can. Well, okay. I'm going to try to get something. It's going to take a while for it all to load up, but hopefully when I'm ready, it'll all be there and we can take a look at it. Let's go ahead and kind of wrap up. And I agree with what you said. And I think, some people will point to and say, well, England already has all these different teams. You know what? And I'll show something here in a second. We have all these different teams. We have hundreds and hundreds of soccer clubs. They're not all at the highest level right now, but there's never been a path to get to the highest level. If you give people a path, just like we've seen in the USL, all these new groups coming in and saying, well, I could come in here. I can test the waters is probably not the right word, but I can get in. I can work with my community. We can build things up. We can work, through meritocracy and go up the pyramid. And we could be a Division I team. We don't have to pay like MLS $500 million just to get the right to say you can be one. Right? There's no, obviously there's always some upfront money that you have to pay, but if you can start down low and with all the teams we have, like, it won't happen in 5 years. And if we look at just getting those 3 levels of non-league football sorted out, took 20 years. But I don't think it needs to take 20 years either. I think there's a lot of ways you can speed up that process if US Soccer and other people, help it along. You obviously don't want to go too fast. There's always potential problems there. Grow too quickly, but we have a lot of infrastructure in this country. It absolutely can be done if people have the will to make it happen.
Yeah, and that really is all it's ever come down to, right? And especially in this, more modern era, the USL, or rather MLS and US Soccer Federation kind of nearly being one and the same at times, though that does seem to be less and less the case. But again, I'm encouraged by what we're seeing. So I really hope the USL can capitalize on some of the growing fervor for soccer in the United States.
Yeah, I do as well. So let's get the last little bit here of history of the pyramid to get to where we are now today in 2025. So in 2003, playoffs were introduced in this is still the Football Conference at this time, what we now know as the National League. But we now get playoffs introduced, and now there's 2 teams that move up, which is where we stand today. But I find it interesting because we had playoffs in the other leagues in the mid 80s. They were introduced. So they finally get introduced here at the non-league level. So now 2 teams will move up automatically into Division. I guess now we're Division 3 at this point in 2003. The very next year, 2004, is where we get the rebranding of the Football League, and we get Championship League 1, League 2, the terms we know today, which have been around now. So about 20 years. That also, though, has a domino effect down below into the National League. So the football conference gets rebranded as the Conference National, and it is considered step one of this new non-league pyramid. We have the two new leagues. Well, sorry. Before 2004, we had three feeder leagues that went into this football conference. They were the Northern Premier League, the Southern League, and the Isthmian League. So we had those three. So there was a little bit of an awkward, like you take your winners and there's a bit of a playoff to be able to move in to what we now know as the National League. So in 2004, the FA steps in and says, okay, we're going to have this Conference National League at the top, step one. We're going to make a new step two, and it's going to be two regional leagues, a North and a South version of this Conference National. They're going to take up step two, and you other three leagues are going to drop down to step three. So now we have a very clear, second step here. It has, instead of three leagues coming in, it has two. So this is, they're starting to implement this 1, 2, 4, 8, 16 set of leagues inside their National League system. So they step in to create that. They take the top teams from the Northern Premier League, the Southern League, and the Isthmian League. They fill out and make up this Conference North and Conference South. And then, of course, now the Northern Premier League, the Southern League, and the Isthmian League all have spaces. So that opens up room for more teams to come in and join the non-league football pyramid. And you get those three leagues to move in there. Eventually, or along with this, we start getting some restructuring down to step 4 and now step 5. And we start balancing some teams, sometimes redrawing leagues slightly. And again, this is all done by the FLS committee, or the Football League System Committee, through the FA. And we get continued tweaking from 2005 to 2015, which is when we eventually call it the National League. But in the 10 years, we eventually, or by the end of that in 2015, we have one league at step 1, two leagues at step 2. We got 3 at step 3, 6 at step 4, 14 at step 5. So we're not quite there to the 1, 2, 4, 8, 16, but we're closer. And this is just 10 years ago, right? 10 years ago, rebrand as the National Leagues, and then we get National League North and National League South. Those control, National League controls steps 1 and step 2 of the pyramid. In 2018, we finally get to that step 3 has 4 leagues now, because the Southern League gets split into a Southern League North and South, I think. Maybe it's West and North. I don't remember, but the Isthmian League is kind of London, and then South and East. The Southern League is above that, kind of the Midlands, and then all the way out to the west towards Land's End. So that gets split into 2 divisions. So now you have your 4 that you need at step 3. And then the pandemic, and 4 divisions at 22 teams each. That's just at 2018. Pandemic messes up some of the plans of kind of getting the next step at 8. But finally, last year, 24-25, we're at step 4 with 8 leagues, 22 teams each. Step 5 is at 16 feeder leagues, and they range from 20 to 24. And step 6 also, well, it's at 17 leagues and anywhere from 18 to 24 teams. Probably unlikely that step 6 is going to go up to 32. It's probably going to stay more of a column through there, and let those county leagues below that, because some of the county leagues are already involved at step 6, but let the county leagues below that kind of help take control of what happens below those steps and how teams can enter their county leagues and move all the way up. So below step 6, it's run by the county FAs. And again, I think, as I said before, if you count up all the county leagues and district leagues in densely populated areas, you can go another 10 levels below step 6 in some areas.
Well, and that's why when we talk about a club like Dorking having like what 12 promotions or something like that,
and
that's what we're talking
Wimbledon,
about.
yeah.
Right, exactly.
And Dorking, actually, when they started, I just looked this up yesterday. I think they came in, or maybe I should phrase it this way: AFC Wimbledon was able to come in about 4 steps higher than Dorking did when they started. And again, that's because it's a little mushier in the National League as you get down to these steps. And the FA usually produces a document at the end or getting ready for the next season that kind of shows for each league which teams got promoted, which teams got relegated, which teams got laterally moved because of the promotions and relegations made things unbalanced. So we see the same thing in this country. We do an East and a West, and you get all your states in the middle, or your cities that are in those states in the middle, like Kansas City, maybe in the East some years, and maybe in the West some years, or Minnesota, right? Like any of those could be if you do some balancing. So they'll do balancing, but also what I find interesting, especially when you get into some of those steps in the non-league football pyramid, is that just like you do at the top, like you have to meet requirements for each level. So there are teams that win their league but choose not to go up or don't meet the requirements to go up. So a team that would have been relegated gets a reprieve and gets to stay in whatever league they were in. So it's like I said, it's a little squishier down as you start getting into steps 4, 5, and 6, and even below that, on how some of these things work. But in a lot of places, like you said, a team like Dorking especially can start at a district league level where they live, and maybe they're sharing a ground with someone, whatever it is, but they can then work their way up to, Dorking, what was the highest they got to? Was that the National League, right? When we did our story on them, and now they're back in the National South. But you can work your way up. AFC Wimbledon, which is now in, are they League One or League Two? I don't remember.
League One, I believe. Yes,
League
I was
One?
just watching their game today, actually.
Okay, but they're up to League One, and started not as low as Dorking, but started in like, I want to say the Combined Counties League or something. And work their way up through the Isthmian League, and then eventually into the National South, and then the National League, and then League Two, and now they're in League One. So there is, for a lot of teams now, a pathway. But like again, in the last 5 years, they're still tweaking some of this. I'm sure over the next decade, there's going to be some tweaks to this as well. And because this National League system is now in place below the Football League, it has helped the county leagues also, who want to give away for their teams in their county leagues. They have agreements with the regional leagues above them to do promotion relegation. So it's also helped organize the leagues down below. And it really took the clubs at first who were stuck outside of the Football League, who wanted a chance to get in, to self-organize a little bit, which is what we see in our country. Like our U.S. soccer has left it up to people to just decide, and different groups to make leagues. But then the FA finally stepped in the 90s and really helped shape these leagues. And there was, we mentioned at the very beginning, two strong amateur leagues, the Northern League, as opposed to the Northern Premier League, which was semi-pro. But the Northern League and the Isthmian League, the Isthmian League kind of jumped in and made some changes sooner, but the Northern League didn't. They really stuck by being an amateur level. And what happened was that league could have been in a position more like the National Premier League or something else higher up in this non-league pyramid, but actually kept seeing themselves get dropped down because another league would get formed above them or something else, because they were determined to stay as an amateur league that might feed in for people who want to go up, but they didn't want to take on the professionalism at all as a league. So all these other leagues kept leapfrogging them up, and they just kept falling down as a league. They're still around. They've been around for, I don't know, more than 100 years. Maybe in the 1900s they were formed, like early 1900s. I don't remember. But they have, like, they've been around for a long time, but just where they kind of fit in the whole system has shifted a little bit over time. And this is also partly why a lot of these leagues got cannibalized or merged. So we have this whole Wikipedia page that lists the 92 different defunct soccer leagues in England. That's part of this process. But even though we do have clubs that have failed in general, we don't see the clubs failing. We just see a reorganizing of leagues that have happened.
Exactly. And that's, I think that's why it's disingenuous when a lot of people talk about clubs getting relegated, folding, or, leagues folding in the context of English football. It kind of misses a large point of what that structure is.
Yeah. And they can, there's still a place for them to exist, as opposed in our country, when you only have one closed league at the top, there is no place for you to exist afterwards. Right. There really isn't. So yes, you do die off. And people are just used to that. Well, if I got kicked out of the top league, like, nobody would show up. It's a different mindset. Some people wouldn't show up, but we saw that with the Loyal. There were some people who, like, if the Loyal stayed and dropped down to League One, as opposed to staying in the championship before they actually folded, there were people say, I wouldn't follow them, right? Because they weren't in a high enough league for them. And that's, it's a different mindset. It's a different culture. We've all been raised in the US, in the system of closed leagues and owner control. Owner can pick up the team and move it wherever they want. I mean, I saw Don Garber talking about, kind of admonishing Vancouver as a call, like, they, in the city, they really need to build a new stadium for that team in order for Vancouver to stay, kind of thing, just in the last couple of days. And that's what I hate about our American leagues. Like, if they want to build a new stadium, then build a new stadium. The stadium they're in is not, there's not a problem with it other than, it doesn't look like all the other nice stadia that they've built recently in MLS.
Yeah.
They want a nice new shiny stadium.
Well,
MLS
and
does.
I think if we're, reading the tea leaves as well, I think they're maybe they're viewing this as a bit of a win-win. Either they get a shiny new stadium to advertise out of it, or they have a pretext to move the team. So it's,
All right, Dylan, that wraps up what we had for at least that. I mean, you could also almost call it the middle level of the English football pyramid, the non-league portion, steps 1 through 6. Any last questions or comments before we wrap things up?
No, not particularly. I appreciate that Wrexham has increased interest, but I encourage folks, if they consider themselves a big soccer fan, to check out some of the leagues even below the National League. You get some really interesting stuff, and especially in the early rounds of the FA Cup, you get some really interesting stories as well. Just like the US Open Cup. So
now, I know we spent a couple episodes here on England just because they have a very robust footballing pyramid that they've developed. But we will, in future episodes, be looking at other countries and their football systems, especially larger countries like Canada, Australia, Brazil, China. I mean, some things that have large geography like we do, and how different groups have tried to tackle that, which may help us have some better conversations about Pro-Rel and open pyramids when it really starts to get close to 2028 and it's actually happening here in the US.
Fingers crossed.
At the professional level, at least.
In theory, fingers crossed.
Yeah, in theory. All right. If you have a question or comment about tonight's show, please drop us a note, or if there's anything you'd like us to cover, and especially in some of these deep dives that we do in terms of football history, you can drop us a comment on our YouTube channel. You can send us a message on Blue Sky at soccershorts@bigpinedigital.com. If you're listening on your podcast app, please send us a text using the send us a text link, which should be at the top of the episode description. We always appreciate your comments and your feedback. And always better yet, if you can join us live. We usually go Tuesday nights at 6 p.m. Pacific time on our YouTube channel and join us for the conversation. Dylan, before we finally sign out, do you have any last comments?
Yeah, I guess a reminder to anybody listening, if they've forgotten, like I've forgotten, that CBS and Paramount Plus have coverage of not just the championship, but League One and League Two this season as well. They may have had a little bit of it last year, but I feel like it's more. I've already noticed it, some of it on my Paramount feed. So that's been nice. Like I said, I just threw on the Wimbledon game today because I saw that it was on. Heartbreak for Wimbledon, but whatever. So yeah, I if you forgot that, here's your reminder. You can catch some League One and League Two action on Paramount Plus.
Yeah, and all the European early league stuff be coming up. We should have a lot of that on TV the next couple of days.
The final knockout round of the Champions League was on Paramount Plus today. I don't know if the final rounds of the Europa League and the Conference League will be, though. I'll have to check.
I think they are.
I hope so. I would love that, but I haven't. I think it might just be select games, to be honest. So
that could be.
Yeah, it looks like Maccabi Tel Aviv versus Dynamo Kiev for some reason.
All right, well, check out your apps between all of those. Enjoy your soccer, whatever it is you're watching, and we'll see everyone again next week. Good night, everyone.